Hello, Phil here from Wings of Pegasus and welcome to another analysis video. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. On the agenda tonight, we're going back to 1973. We're going to be taking a look at Todd Rundgren and he's going to be performing Hello, It's Me. Let's get Todd up on screen and see how he gets on.
But something's wrong. There's something here that doesn't last too long. Maybe I shouldn't think of you as mine. Seeing you or seeing anything as much as I do you, I take for granted that you're always there. I take for granted that you just don't care. Sometimes I can't help seeing all the way through. It's important to me in a while, or if I ever need a reason to smile and spend the night if you think I should. It's important to me in a while, or if I ever need a reason to smile and spend the night if you think I should.
And there we have it. I was planning on jumping into this performance, but sometimes that will happen when you start listening to a composition and get into the story of the composition. And it's quite an emotional story, especially from Todd. This was actually the first original song that he ever wrote, and it's obviously got a connection in there. That's why it's so engaging when he's delivering it live. The guys did take the mickey out of him for this particular performance, or should I say the image that he went for with this performance. It was all around at the time, so it wasn't rare to see a performer who would really go for it one night in terms of the image. But getting into Todd's ability as a multi-instrumentalist, but also someone that could sing to the level that he can with this live performance, showing his ability to get up into falsetto and then come back down into chest voice, Obviously, when he is in his falsetto singing sound, he's not going to be bringing that down, because if you bring your falsetto too far down, it's just going to break, because those are two different vocal registers between the chest and falsetto. Not to get head voice and falsetto confused, because Todd here is in chest voice for the most part. When he does go up to that top end of his range in falsetto, those aren't going to blend together. You can blend chest voice into head voice and have your mixed voice in between those two registers, but falsetto is a totally different department. And with great singers, it is so hard sometimes to tell the difference between head voice and falsetto, because great singers can take a head voice tone and put a little bit more air through the vocal cords so it sounds like a falsetto sound, but they can bring that down all the way into their chest voice. It's amazing to think as well that Todd, as a live performer, when he was 21, he thought that his calling was to be a producer, and as everybody will know, it certainly was his calling in terms of the natural ability he had for production and the amount of bands that he produced. Whenever he was performing and making his own records, he was working on other people's records at the same time. So he has such a talent in the studio. But being that multi-instrumentalist of being able to play guitar, bass, drums, keys, and sing, and obviously supply his own harmony vocals, means that he could get into a studio and do a whole album himself. The introduction to this particular performance stated that Todd's going to be playing to a backing track, and Todd's playing everything on that backing track. And I don't think that was strictly true with the 1973 release of Hello, It's Me, because we had Michael Brecker on tenor sax and also Randy Brecker on trumpet. So there were some horn elements in there that Todd didn't play. And I think there are some backing vocals in there that aren't Todd's voice, they're female vocals. So Todd, I don't think, did everything on this, but needless to say, in terms of putting together a track as a whole, if he wanted to, that's something that he did. Todd is heavily into technology and computer programming, and he said himself that if he hadn't have been a musician and a producer, he would have been a computer programmer. In fact, he came up with a paint program for the very early Apple Macs. Another thing that he did in the year 2000 was something called Patronet. And this is an early version of the site Patreon, which is like crowdfunding, and it's a site that I'm a part of, and I always mention about my patrons that make these videos possible. But Todd made a website back in the year 2000 so that fans of the music could become a patron of his, and they would get releases through that website, and they could buy all of Todd's music through his website independently. He didn't need a record label. So Todd was one of those guys that really started it all off in terms of crowdfunding. So when Todd was 19, he had his first band called Nazz, and he was heavily influenced by the bands from the British invasion in the mid-60s. But before this band that he had when he was 19, he had been playing blues, but he really wanted to start writing original material and songs like the Beatles. So in 1968, they'd recorded 4 demo discs, and off the back of those discs, they got signed to Atlantic Records, and they started work on their debut album. And Todd was paying attention to everything that the producer was doing in the studio, to the point where when the producer left and they'd finished the album, Todd thought, well, why don't we just try and remix it ourselves? And by the way, he didn't have any experience in the studio. It was just a case of trial and error, so that they would change the sound however they could on the mixing desk and just find their own way of doing it. And fortunately, they were given the hours to mix it themselves, and that's exactly what Todd did. So that first album, which was just called Nazz, was mixed and effectively produced by Todd, even though he didn't take a credit for that album, even though the record label said that he should have done. They released 3 albums in all: Nazz, Nazz, and Nazz 3. For the third album, Todd had already left the band. I think it was released in 1971, but Todd left in 1969, and I think this was due to Todd's writing just developing into something different than it had been when he was writing with Nazz, because he'd been listening to Laura Nyro, and she'd been influenced in her writing with jazz and major seventh chords, and it's something that Todd wanted to implement in his own songs. So in 1969 was the same year that Todd had his calling in terms of thinking that he wanted to get into production, and he joined up with Albert Grossman in that year. And Albert had just founded Ampex Records, so they teamed up, and Todd was doing some sound engineering work for Albert and was also producing in the same studio. Straight off the bat, he engineered on an album by the band which was called Stage Fright, and that got to number 5 in the charts. So a project that was really early on in his career as an engineer and a producer was a massive hit. So he started to get a reputation as early as 1970 when that was released. So Todd wasn't sure at this point whether he'd return to performing or whether he'd just be a producer. And in 1970 he started working on his first solo album, even though it wasn't to be known as a solo album because he didn't want to make that jump to being a fully fledged solo artist. So it was released as Runt, and that's just how it was known, and he wasn't credited with that album at the time. From that album, We Gotta Get You a Woman got to number 20 in the charts, and a bit of trivia about that album as well, because Tony Fox Sales played bass on that album, and he was 17 years of age, and his brother played drums, and his brother was called Hunt Sales, and he was 14 years of age. So if you get a chance to listen to that album, you now know that that's a 14-year-old drummer and a 17-year-old bassist. As mentioned earlier, Todd was working on other projects at the same time as his own album. One of those was Half Nelson, the album that would go on to give Sparks their break in the industry, so he had a massive hand in that. His follow-up album was called Runt, the Ballad of Todd Rundgren, and that did really well. Actually, it's been referred to as one of the best singer-songwriter albums from that whole era. And at this time, he was still working on other projects. In 1971, he produced the Badfinger album, Straight Up. And if you want to check out Badfinger as a band independently, they've got a video here on the channel somewhere as well. So the album Something Everything followed in 1972, and that had this track on it, Hello It's Me, which got to number 5 in the charts. And this track was initially released in 1968, I believe, but it was re-recorded and re-released on that album. In 1973, the year of this performance, A Wizard, A True Star was released, and he was also producing other bands at the time. Grand Funk was one of those bands, and you can check them out. They've got their own separate video here somewhere. And Utopia all started up in that year as well. Like I mentioned, he got a little bit of stick for this particular image with his performance. So in 1974, they released Todd Rundgren's Utopia, and I'm not going to have time to get through all of Todd's albums, but he released albums in the mid-70s, late 70s, early 80s. 1985 is when he released A Cappella, and that one stands out because that whole album was made just with Todd's voice and the way that he manipulated it in the studio in order to make every one of those tracks. Something that I want to mention about the live performances in the late 70s with Todd, because he was involved with getting down, obviously, the instrumentation on albums, the production, the mixing, but he also got involved with the speaker setup for live performances, and to this end, he would have an input trying to implement a quadraphonic speaker system for his live performances. And what that is, if you imagine the room as a square, if they're playing a gig, you have surround sound, so a speaker in each corner. So it means that you've got 4 speakers in the room. And this is something that Todd wanted to have for live performances, so there'd be speakers behind the audience as well. The only problem was it took so long to set this up for each performance. They had to have 2 sets of these quadraphonic systems that they would set up for one gig, and whilst that gig was being played on one night, they'd go ahead to the next venue and start setting up the next quadraphonic system. Unfortunately, because Todd was literally doing everything with helping the setup and getting it all organized, but then having to perform, he just got exhausted and couldn't maintain that level of involvement with the system setup of the live gigs, but it just gives you an idea as to how involved Todd was with every single element of the music. In the early 80s is when he designed that Paint program for the early Apple Macs, and in 1989 is when he released the album Nearly Human, and that was a live studio album. He also released another live album in 1991 that was in front of an audience, but they were all told to stay quiet for the recording of that whole album. In the year 2000, as I mentioned before, he started releasing his music independently through Patronet, that site that he created, but also through his band site. And in 2019, this year, he's been touring with Joey Molland from Badfinger, and also he's not in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and this is always a point of mass discussion, especially considering the names of the nominees for the next class of 2020 that is being discussed all over the place for a very long time, considering some of the nominees that are in that list, but let's not get into that here. We're just going to be appreciating Todd's performance here in 1973 and his overall ability as a musician and a multi-instrumentalist, because he was one of the first, if not the first guys that would get in the studio and have such a wide skill set, being able to record all the instruments himself, but then mix it and produce it himself to then have a product that is purely him and his work. And it would have certainly been an inspiration to those guys that then came later, like Prince, for example, one of the total all-round artists with all of that ability in order to have that production ability and play all of the instruments. Todd was one of those guys who could not only do all of that, he was a fantastic producer and is a fantastic producer. When I mentioned in my Meatloaf video about the stuff that Todd did with Bat Out of Hell, just listen to that, because there are so many unique techniques that Todd would use to get the guitar to sound like a motorcycle, for example. So many different things that Todd was at the forefront of in that studio. But thank you guys so much for suggesting this video for me to take a look at, and keep those suggestions coming in the comments below. Let me know what you guys think, and if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe, and I'll see you guys at the next one. Rock!